Good morning and welcome to this virtual event. I'm Dave Ricks, Chairman and CEO of Eli Lilly and Company, as well as the President of the International Federation of Pharmaceutical Manufacturers and Associations. Today we're gathering to announce the launch of the AMR Action Fund, a fund built by more than 20 leading biopharmaceutical companies with an investment of nearly $1 billion. The aim of the fund is to bring 2 to 4 new antibiotics to patients by 2030. And the fund will invest in small biotech companies focused on developing new antibiotics, new novel antibiotics that address the highest priority public health needs. These new therapies will address the urgent problem of antimicrobial resistance, or AMR. AMR is like a COVID-19 pandemic nearly every year. Statistics show us that AMR kills 700,000 people globally in just the last year. And by 2050, it could kill as many as 20 million annually. Unlike COVID-19, this isn't a surprise. This is a trend that we can predict with some accuracy. You'll hear from a patient later, a former professional athlete who had an infection that was driven by an antibiotic-resistant superbug, which ended his playing career and nearly ended his life. The AMR fund we're building can provide part of the solution, but it's only a part. We also need help from government policymakers in the US and globally, because there is no viable marketplace today for a new antibiotic. And the pipeline, while supported by great science now, is near collapse. New antibiotics are used sparingly to preserve their effectiveness, like a fire extinguisher on the wall. You hope to never have to use it. So it's hard to offset the extremely expensive development costs with sales that everyone hopes will approach zero. We need market-based policy reforms, reimbursement reforms, with new incentives for successfully bringing new antibiotics to protect patients to the marketplace. You'll hear from some policymakers on that later today as well. So thank you for tuning in to focus on this important issue. And now we'll roll a video introducing our groundbreaking AMR Action Fund. Then Michelle McMurray-Heath, President and CEO of the Bio Organization, will talk with Brandon Noble.
The world benefits from today's major advances in modern medicine, but we may be losing the powerful tool that enables these advances due to a silent global pandemic that already kills around 700,000 people each year. The uncontrolled rise of superbugs due to antimicrobial resistance, or AMR. AMR occurs when a microorganism changes in ways that make existing medicines ineffective. This process is now happening faster than new antibiotics are being developed. And because AMR can affect anyone, of any age, in any country, it's a growing problem that requires collaborative action today. To help address this growing crisis, over 20 leading pharmaceutical companies have come together to invest over $1 billion through the AMR Action Fund. Together with others, this groundbreaking fund aims to bring 2 to 4 new antibiotics to patients by the end of the decade. Without new antibiotics, the health of future generations is in jeopardy. The AMR Action Fund is only part of the solution to accelerate the discovery of new antibiotics. So we will work with partners to create a policy environment that enables sustainable private investment into the pipeline. We have a critical opportunity to tackle AMR. Antibiotics save lives and are the foundation of modern medicine. Progress can't wait. We won't rest in the fight against AMR. Learn more about the AMR Action Fund at amractionfund.com.
My name is Dr. Michelle McMurray-Heath, and I'm the President and CEO of the Biotechnology Innovation Organization. We represent many of the biotech startups trying to innovate new antimicrobial products for patients in need. I'm honored this morning to be here with Brandon Noble. As you heard in the intro, Brandon was a defensive tackle in the NFL, playing in San Francisco, Dallas, and Washington, D.C. That was until he contracted a dangerous antimicrobial resistant infection that ended his career and nearly took his life. Brandon, thank you so much for joining us today. Would you mind telling everyone a little bit about your story?
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. I appreciate you guys having me and let me tell my story. Like Michelle mentioned, I went to college at Penn State, played football there, undrafted free agent, spent 2 years in the 49ers organization, then 4 years with the Cowboys. And then I became a free agent and went to Washington to play for the Redskins. And while I was there, I actually had a couple knee surgeries, blew out an ACL, an MCL, a PCL, and dislocated a kneecap all at one time in 2003. Came back and played in 2004 the whole season. They thought my career was over. After the 2004 season, because my body was a little bit out of whack now from all the years of punishment, I blew out a little meniscus in my right knee. Had to go in just for a routine arthroscopic procedure. They cleaned my knee out and went back to work. I was close to coming off of the crutches after about 5 or 6 days. They took my stitches out, and the next morning, one of my portholes looked like a little red quarter, and the pain was pretty intense immediately. And the next thing I knew, it had covered my whole knee within about 12 hours. So I went back to Redskin Park, had them take a look at me, went back and forth with some doctors. They obviously knew there was something wrong. They gave me some general antibiotics and sent me home. It happened to be a Thursday or a Friday. So I went home, and over the next kind of 36 to 48 hours, it went from that quarter-sized hot spot to covering my knee to basically turning my right leg from the groin to the ankle into just a giant trunk of flaming red skin. And it was disgusting. It was maybe the most pain I'd ever been in my entire life. And considering what I just told you, that I actually blew out my left knee to the proportion that I did, that's saying something. And I was actually laying unconscious on the sofa in my family room as my daughter's second birthday party was getting ready to start. My mother-in-law's a nurse. She walked in the door. She told my wife, she said, "We got to get him to the hospital right now." Thankfully, my agent made a couple quick phone calls. They sent me down to Sibley Medical Center in the DC area where they got me looked at and stabilized. And the infectious disease doctors came in and said, told my parents who drove me, because they were there for my daughter's second birthday party, if you guys would have waited another 12 hours, we would probably be taking his leg off or he'd be dead. And he's got MRSA. And we'd never heard of MRSA before. I was one of the first guys in the NFL to contract it and then kind of go public with it. There was a rash of it for a while. And so it was close. I spent 7 days in the hospital, had to have surgery. They flushed my right knee out. Thankfully, it didn't go septic. It stayed in the knee and in the skin, but it never got out of that area. But it was a real close call. I went home with a PICC line in on vancomycin, and that wore me out. Again, I was a professional athlete. At the time, I'm 6'2", about 310 pounds, in the best shape of my life. The elite of the elite, really, in that world. And I had been floored by something that I'd never heard of, and didn't even know what it was, and was able to come back and get ready for camp for the 2004 season. Ended up getting a bone bruise in my left knee, which is reconstructed. Spent the next couple months rehabbing that, was put on IR. And at the end of the season, around December, my knee just kept flaring up. They were draining it. Eventually they gave me a shot, a cortisone injection, which which I learned later lowers the immune system in the joint. And 2 days later, I started feeling sick again. My knee started turning red. And next thing I know, I'm calling my agent again. He's calling the doctor, who's saying, "Come back to the hospital right now for surgery." I'm calling my wife as I'm driving home. I turn around. Next thing I know, it's Thursday night. I'm getting cut open again and my knee flushed. I wake up Friday morning. They put another PICC line in my arm. And my wife comes in and gives birth to our third child that afternoon. So it was a busy time in the Noble house, not to mention Christmas and the New Year right around the corner. That was our third kid. Busy time of year. Post-op, about 2 to 3 weeks later after the holidays. At this point, I'm completely worn out because I skipped a spot. I had a bad reaction to the vancomycin the first time. So they put me on kind of a cocktail of antibiotics the second time. And what that did to me, right, I was so lethargic. I couldn't get up. I had no energy. I didn't want to move. I couldn't eat. It's hard to keep things down and even to eat anything. My diet consisted of yogurt and bagels. And once I got to that point, I actually ended up throwing multiple blood clots into my lungs. I had 4 in one lung and 3 in the other, and almost died again. Went to the hospital, spent 7, 8 days in there, and they put me back together. They offered to put screens in my arteries or veins in my legs so I could play again. And my wife, thankfully, was in the room, and Mary Kate was like, "Look, Doc, he's done." And that's really how I retired from the NFL. And then I got to add blood thinners to the cocktail of antibiotics that I was already taking due to the MRSA.
Amazing. It's an amazing story. I think many people think of antibiotics as just a simple thing they get from their family physician when they have a sore throat or sinusitis, but you're talking about the big guns and making your way through all of those potential options on the shelf. Today, we're here discussing a new financial commitment for more than 20 biopharmaceutical companies to develop new effective antibiotics. What impact do you hope this effort will have?
Well, I mean, look, this is something that I've been talking about now for 15 years. I was diagnosed the first time in 2004. I got involved with the Infectious Disease Society of America. I testified in front of a Senate subcommittee or something along those lines. And it seems like we're kind of in the same place 15 years later. So this is awesome, right? I mean, look, congratulations on getting this done. Let's keep that momentum going. I mean, it means a lot. This thing almost killed me. As I went through and kind of became an advocate, for people that have had, AMR, I also appreciate shortening the words down a little bit there for guys like me to say. But I met so many people that lost loved ones to some sort of AMR, right? Whether it was MRSA or anything else that they, and however they got it. And it's terrible. I got 3 kids. I've got a wife, I mean, we need to do something about it. This is a great first step. I was really excited when I was contacted to be a part of this.
Thank you, Brandon. And just one last question. In the NFL, you had access to some of the highest quality care in the world. And even then, it was a really tough fight. In your work now as a coach, you're seeing younger players facing similar risks. What's your message today for the next generation and to the companies fighting to develop new antibiotics?
Well, I think the big thing is to continue to get the word out there that this is an issue, right? I mean, look at, we got a lot going on in the world right now, but AMR isn't going away, right? It's been here, and the bug will keep evolving, right? So we've got to stay in front of this, and we've let it get ahead, and we've got to continue to catch up and then get in front. And I think from the lower levels, I've been a college football coach for 8 years, a high school football coach for 3. And I've seen it at the locker room level where you don't have the best care in the world, and it's really scary. And so getting the information out there, making sure people understand what it is, how to take care of it, and then giving doctors the ammo to fight it. Right at the end of the day, the drugs that they have to pull out right now are old drugs too. So again, stay on top of it, right? Be aware of it, be smart about it, and get ahead of it, please.
Thank you so much for sharing your story and for letting everyone know how critical it is to address this.
Thanks for having me. This has been a lot of fun.
Thanks again, Michelle, and especially Brandon, for sharing that powerful story. I'm Steve Ubel, President and CEO of Pharma. I want to start this morning by acknowledging, as we all know, that we're in the midst of the worst pandemic any of us have seen in our lifetimes. And while COVID-19 continues to spread, this disease is also exacerbating another increasing area of concern, antimicrobial resistance, or AMR. To respond to COVID-19, doctors desperate to save patients are using a large amount of antibiotics to treat hospitalized patients who are at risk for secondary bacterial and fungal infections caused by ventilators or weakened immune systems. This could speed up superbug growth, and in fact, initial data suggests that 1 in 7 patients hospitalized with COVID-19 acquired a dangerous secondary bacterial infection, and 50% of patients who died had such infections. At the same time this emerging crisis is growing, research and development for new medicines to address AMR has been dwindling, and the current environment for investment is insufficient to achieve a sustainable pipeline. That's why our industry is taking bold action to ensure a robust and diverse pipeline of new medicines to treat drug-resistant infections. As Dave and Michelle mentioned, more than 20 global biopharmaceutical companies have pledged to invest nearly $1 billion through the new AMR Action Fund. The fund aims to bring 2 to 4 new antimicrobials to market by 2030, focusing on innovative medicines that address the highest public health needs. The fund will also provide technical support to emerging companies, giving them access to deep expertise and resources of large biopharmaceutical companies to strengthen and accelerate the development of novel antimicrobial medicines. It's important to note that the fund is highly collaborative, involving a broad range of biopharmaceutical companies, philanthropies, development banks, and multilateral organizations, some of which you'll hear over the course of today's event. I'd also like to note that in concurrence with this event, there's an event happening in Europe as well to announce the fund, and later today there will be an event in Japan to highlight this global effort. To explain a bit more about how our companies are working together to solve this emerging public health crisis, I'm joined today by Ken Frazier, the CEO of Merck, Dave Ricks, of course, from Eli Lilly, and Dr. Albert Bourla from Pfizer. Dave, maybe we'll start with you with the first question. You were instrumental in pulling the fund together. Can you tell us, in getting the international trade associations together along with Pharma and Bio, how the fund came together and why it's so critical to advancing antimicrobial medicines to market?
Absolutely. Thanks for that introduction, Steve. And thanks for everyone for being here. This, of course, started in the background of a widely accepted and understood problem that's growing. As I said in the introduction, this isn't a sudden event. It's been occurring for some time. And I think the story we just heard is a great example of that, which happened more than a decade ago. Each year, more and more resistance builds, so we can accurately predict this will be a huge problem if we don't do something now. Public health experts, industry participants all recognize this, that antimicrobials are really like the mortar holding the building of healthcare together. And without effective antibiotics, even basic routine procedures like root canals or treatment with cancer care cannot function properly. So noting all this, discussions with peers, with the IFPMA organization began, and we explored options. What could we do to fill what was a clear problem, noting recent bankruptcies in the biotech area and an ever-increasing number of major companies that had just stopped searching for new antibiotics, not necessarily because the science wasn't there, but because the marketplace wasn't there. So we wanted to build a fund that could bridge that promising new science to a future where perhaps there is a policy environment where companies can invest, and this can be a thriving market again. The purpose of the fund is to do just that, to keep the science moving, investing in promising early targets that are emerging now, perhaps as many as 20, and at the same time, advocate for policies that can support an ongoing and continued effort so that the world has an armamentarium of new antibiotics at all times. Perhaps our company is an example of this. We at one point were one of the largest antibiotic manufacturers and researchers in the world. About 25 years ago, we stopped researching in that area because scientific reasons, but also the market itself. We're interested in the field, and this is a way to participate. And I think companies like Merck, Pfizer's, others with us today are also thinking about this the very, very same way. Of course, COVID-19 came along while we were discussing this, and I think for us really crystallized the impact of public health crisis and the incredibly important role this industry has in addressing those. I mentioned bringing expertise. We're also bringing know-how in our scientific teams to make sure we invest in the very best and most promising really novel targets that can help address the key resistant bacteria we see today and those that are predicted in the future. Finally, just to say, we need some help across the board. While the industry can help address the science, make sure we invest in great new molecules that could affect antibiotic resistance, the keys to unlocking a sustainable market are really in the hands of the policy makers. And it's undeniable that this market has failed. It's expensive to develop a new antibiotic. And right now, the promise of a market is really thin. And we saw that recently with a few bankruptcies that occurred. So you'll hear today that we need help in that department. And the industry will be looking forward to partnering with policymakers to find solutions to this broken marketplace.
Ken, why don't we turn to you? Merck has had a long commitment to international development as well as addressing the public health crisis caused by AMR. Can you tell us about Merck's experience and why it's so critical to address AMR and how this fund will drive antibiotic innovation?
I want to thank you, Steve, for introducing me, Dave, for putting this together, Michelle, for that excellent introduction, and Brandon, it clear on very human terms why this is a very consequential thing that we're talking about. So for more than 100 years, Merck has played a significant role in the discovery and development of novel medicines and vaccines to combat infectious diseases, including for public health priorities like AMR, HIV, Ebola, and COVID-19. We're one of the few biopharmaceutical companies still investing in antimicrobial R&D, and we have active and focused stewardship and surveillance efforts. We see AMR as one of the most pressing public health crises the world is facing. In the long term, it has the potential to cause even greater mortality and economic damage than COVID-19 if we don't address it. COVID-19 patients are suffering secondary infections, as we've heard, which can be the actual cause of death if they're not effectively treated. And that further underscores why we need new and better antibiotics. As part of our longstanding commitment to AMR, we're proud to be investing $100 million into the AMR Action Fund. This is a powerful example of how the pharmaceutical industry can come together to make a huge difference for patients and society. So far, over 20 leading pharmaceutical companies, as you've heard, have pledged to invest nearly $1 billion through the new AMR Action Fund with the goal of bringing 2 to 4 new antibiotics to market by 2030. And with the support of philanthropies, development banks, and multilateral organizations, we'd expect that this fund will invest well over $1 billion into antibiotic development. This will provide critical resources to help bridge the most innovative antibiotic candidates, those that target the priority pathogens identified by the Centers for Disease Control in the early pipeline through to patients. But beyond funding, the AMR Action Fund will also provide technical support to portfolio companies, giving them access to the deep expertise and resources of large pharmaceutical companies to strengthen and accelerate antibiotic development. Companies like Merck and others have built up tremendous expertise in antibiotic development and can provide valuable support to help small biotechs bring promising new technologies through the challenging later stages of clinical development. Currently, we are seeing just too many companies active in this space failing because they can't obtain venture capital funding, or if they make it to the market, they can't make a return that allows them to continue. If we can keep just a few key promising antibiotics moving and governments taking the right steps to fix this broken system, together we can make tangible progress in addressing the AMR challenge. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ken. Albert, Pfizer's also been at the vanguard of many vaccine and surveillance programs for infectious disease and AMR. In your experience, how is collaboration essential to successfully addressing this challenge?
Thank you, Stephen. Let me start by saying it's a great honor to be in a panel of those esteemed colleagues and being interviewed by you. I believe that both competition and collaboration are very important to be able to address this challenge. Competition because this gives this oomph, this gives this pride to the scientists, to the people that are manufacturing, that they want to bring first the solution to the world. And then later they want to bring a better solution to the world. So that will continue rising the bar higher and higher. But collaboration also is extremely important because in the complexity of the scientific realities of today and the way that the science has proliferated and diversified, in order to be able to harness this diversity, we need to collaborate. And COVID-19 is a very good example when a crisis mode is revealing how important a collaboration will be. And I would say that COVID-19 and AMR, they have very common characteristics. They both spread very fast. They are becoming both significant economic issue to the global economy. And both of them, they require significant interventions, policy interventions and surveillance. And coming to the collaboration, I believe that right now there is no one that can alone be able to address the issues as effective as if they partner with others. And one of the good examples of how a collaborative spirit can advance science and the cause of discovering more and better medicines or vaccines per se to address the situation, it is the surveillance systems, as you very just mentioned. The surveillance systems are extremely important tool for those that they are working to develop solutions and for those medical solutions in the research field, but also for those that they are working to develop policy solutions, how to address issues of antimicrobial resistance. And Pfizer has one of the largest surveillance system in the world, Atlas, it is called, where we are making public, in a public domain, all this information, both for microbials and antifungals and fungal infections available publicly. This is a very important tool. And this is a very important contribution to a collaboration because this is what people will see and then they will understand how things are evolving so that they can develop solutions. In fact, very recently, we announced a partnership with Wellcome that we extend the surveillance also to multiple countries like Kenya, Ghana, Uganda, that they are shows to low-income countries so that we will be able also to monitor the antimicrobial trends in these areas. Extremely, extremely important, and I will add my voice to what the previous colleagues just said, that the initiative that we are taking, it is an initiative that is contributing money and scientific expertise so that we will be able collaboratively to develop solutions. This is an initiative that we are taking because it is the right thing to do. It is an initiative that we are taking because we believe will have significant impact. But frankly, we are also taking because others that they should take initiatives, they don't. And I'm speaking about people that they should see that we have here clearly a market failure, a situation where a major public health need is not accompanied by a significant size market, which creates completely no incentives for people that they don't have to means, like us, for example, here, Lilly or Merck or Pfizer, to do things on the side. But all this biotech ecosystem that is so vital to be able to do the research that is needed, they don't have no incentive to do it, or if they try it, they will face with bankruptcy. So I think it is the right thing to do, but I think should be perceived as the contribution of a group of companies and an industry that cares, and that should be the example for also legislators and others to take steps to this direction, because this is a very, very big problem.
Thanks, Albert. And your last comment is really a segue to the last question I wanted to ask the panel before we kick it over to the media for questions. It's clear that the fund is going to provide a valuable source of both capital and expertise, but it alone can't solve this problem. As each of you have touched on to a certain degree, policymakers have to engage and advance solutions needed to restore the innovation ecosystem. I'm wondering if each of you could just touch on that a bit and talk about what's needed to restore this marketplace.
If I can start. Well, first of all, the fund's being developed to really bridge, to buy time toward the future. There's a promising set of early phase candidates from innovative companies like those with us today, but also initiatives like CARB-X, others you'll hear in a panel later, that have harnessed new science that's been developed in the industry and in academic labs against antibiotic resistance. But without this fund, which is really designed to fund clinical development, the most expensive stage of research, these ideas will wither on the vine, they won't progress, and we'll have lost another generation of new possibilities to arrest antimicrobial resistance in the later part of this decade and the decade beyond. We can't let that happen. That's why we're standing up this fund. What we need to do at the time we're buying with this effort is to change the policy environment so that actors, financial actors, government actors, industry actors have an incentive to really make this a self-sustaining effort. And we're hopeful that we can engage across the world to create that new environment. It will take some time. There aren't that many efforts right now. We need to get those jump started, and we need to do it quickly because we probably are buying 4 or 5 years of time with this initiative.
In recent years, we've seen a number of companies, both large and small, exiting this space because the current environment simply doesn't support the level of sustained investment needed. And for those who are not familiar, it takes on average 12 to 15 years to develop a medicine. So we do need sustained investment. We need reimbursement policies that fairly reward innovation and risk and signal to companies that they should emphasize and strengthen their investment in antibiotic R&D. Otherwise, we'll see these trends of people exiting continue. Here in the United States, Merck has been working with a broad coalition, including IDSA, Pew, biotechs, and patient groups on several policy initiatives to address the reimbursement challenges associated with novel antibiotics. Again, don't forget the analogy Dave used of the fire extinguisher that we want to have in case there's a fire, but hope never to use. I'm particularly grateful to the leadership of Senators Casey and Cassidy on this issue. They are co-sponsors of the Disarm Act, a bipartisan bill that has been introduced in both the Senate and House that will provide add-on payments to hospitals for certain high-need antibiotics. This would help improve patient access to these critical antibiotics, as well as stabilizing the antibiotic pipeline.
Just very few things to add because I spoke about it earlier, as you said. And I have a full agreement with what Dave and Ken said about this topic. And for me, if there's an area that I would like to focus, it is let's create incentives. If there will be incentives that one way or another, scientists can work and know that there will be a market for this product, and innovative companies can invest for all these years that Ken said, I think science will win eventually. I believe that there will be solutions that will be fine. But this is not the case when there is no money, because unfortunately, goodwill is not enough to find solutions to these issues. It requires significant amount of investments, and from investors that they are willing to put their money 99 times and fail before one of these projects will be successful. This is the high risk profile of investments like that. But still, the science will win if we do it. But there needs to be incentives.
Thank you, Albert. I want to thank the entire panel, and I'd like to kick it now to the media for any questions. My colleague, Priscilla Vanderveer, has been cultivating these inquiries, and I'll turn it over to Priscilla.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you all of you for speaking. We have time for 1 or 2 quick questions. The first one is there an emphasis from the fund, and we got this question from several folks, but is there an emphasis on small and mid-size enterprises since these novel antibacterials are increasingly being developed by these small companies? What extent will the fund work with those types of companies? And also, how do we move the candidates that are currently being tested in test tubes? How will we get those drugs to the next stage?
Great question. The answer is yes. The focus will be on small and middle-sized enterprises that lack the access to capital to keep the pipeline moving. I think fundamentally, large companies like those on the call today will continue their own efforts, but can also add to the external pipeline that is being developed, but is currently languishing due to lack of access to capital. We also can bring regulatory and scientific expertise to bear. And the focus of the fund will be on not on repurposed or iterative ideas, but truly novel or breakthrough type of candidates for clinical testing that could have the biggest impact 10 years down the line or so. So that's the focus as we get started here.
We have another question from Chris Dahl at SIDRAP News. What is the opinion of some of the subscription-based models, the payment models for antibiotics that are being tested in the UK? Is that something that could potentially work in the United States?
I would say that we need to be very creative in creating ways that eventually there will be a reward for those that they are investing at risk to bring those solutions. And that could be one of them. Value-based agreements could be one of the way of doing, or subscription like Netflix type of models can be also engaged, or ideas that legislators will reward with vouchers those that they are doing work in anti-infectives so that they can get maybe the benefit in another product that they are developing. There are multiple things that can be done. And I don't think that one will be only the solution, but I think what is required, it is goodwill and understanding of how acute the issue is, and also understand that decisions that we will make now will give results in many years. We don't have time to wait. We need to act now to hope that we can see some significant advancements in 8 to 10 years from now. So it's not that we have time.
Well, we want to turn it over to our next speaker. And Dr. Borla, I will ask you to introduce our next speaker. If media or any participants have additional questions, please feel free to continue to put those in the Q&A function, and we can answer them, or you can contact us directly at Pharma and we will follow up with you. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Borla.
Thank you very much. And ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor right now to introduce the Assistant Secretary for Health from HHS, Admiral Brett Zerois. Admiral Zerois' list of prestigious accomplishments is too lengthy to cover at the time allotted, but let me share some highlights. Admiral Zerois is a pediatric critical care specialist and a physician scientist who has served in several leadership positions in the federal government, as well as in academia. He has authored or co-authored more than 100 scientific publications, editorials, and book chapters, and is the recipient of numerous honors and awards, including the U.S. Secretary of Defense Medal for Outstanding Public Service, the American Heart Association's President Lyndon Baines Johnson Research Award, and the American Society of Nephrologists President's Medal. As the Assistant Secretary for Health, Admiral Zerois leads development of HHS-wide public health policy recommendations and oversees many critical national initiatives, including a historic new plan to end the HIV epidemic in America, the Physical Activity Guidelines for Americans, a much needed set of guidelines, and a cross-agency effort to improve the outcomes of patients living with sickle cell disease. I would like to personally thank Admiral Zerois for his recognition of the need for innovation in the anti-infective space, and for the work that HHS is doing to revitalize the pipeline for anti-infective therapies and actions being taken to protect Americans from infectious diseases. On behalf of the AMR Action Fund, we look forward to working closely with the US government on the delivery of innovative, new anti-infective therapies to the patients who need them, and policy initiatives that can further accelerate this pipeline. It's my honor to turn it over to Admiral Zerois.
Well, thank you very, very much for that introduction. And I am really, truly honored to be with you here today, even virtually, because I do think this is a globally significant event about a topic which I have been professionally committed and have been personally passionate for at least 30 years. I practiced pediatric critical care for about 14 years, between 1990 and 2004. And that's pretty much ancient history as far as AMR goes. but literally not a day went by that I did not have a child struggling for survival in a life and death battle with a resistant organism, mostly bacteria, but sometimes even resistant fungi. Resistant microbes killed my patients, our nation's children. And just really, to be honest, as I think all you know, is really hell on the physicians and nurses trying to predict the unpredictable, looking for solutions, looking for an antibiotic that works, all with really extraordinarily high stakes. So the first thing I want to say to everyone here is thank you. This is bold, it's pretty gutsy, potentially transformational, but this kind of effort is absolutely essential. I do think this partnership represents, in my mind, the best of corporate responsibility. The money is impressive, and we all know that. It takes a lot of money to get this done. But money alone can't buy the intellectual commitment and intellectual resources and history of innovation that this partnership represents. The U.S. government cannot do this alone. Having been in academia and government all over, academia can't do it alone. NIH can't do this alone. And I hope the international community, which I have started working with very heavily through the WHO and now on the executive board of the WHO, understands that we need commercial industry partnerships. We cannot get there from here without public-private partnerships such as this one. Let's think about COVID, which I have been literally 24/7 immersed in for the past several months. We've performed 39 million COVID tests in the United States. Why is that? Because we developed industry partnerships with labs, with retailers, with biomedical and laboratory developers. We have specific treatment, remdesivir, and hopefully soon immune plasma, monoclonal antibodies, and many other small molecules. Why is that? Because of industry partnerships and public-private collaboration. And we almost take it for granted. It's really amazing to me that we almost take it for granted that we will have a safe and effective vaccine with 100 million doses in early 2021. Why is that? Because of effective industry partnerships. As all of you know, the CDC estimates that each year, more than 2.8 million antimicrobial resistant infections occur in the US, and more than 35,000 Americans die with these infections. Truly, AMR is a slow, silent pandemic that has been smoldering, but recently igniting globally. You will never see CNN say 500 people died of AMR today. You just won't see that, but it is just as real as the COVID deaths we count every day. Antimicrobial resistance, I do believe, is the existential threat of this century. As you noted, we have been busy. The U.S. government is responding to AMR with a comprehensive and coordinated suite of actions implemented by diverse agencies, guided by a One Health approach, which is so important, that addresses 5 interrelated goals: prevention and control of infection, surveillance, diagnostic testing, innovation in treatment and development, and international coordination. Under the original National Action Plan for CARB, which covered 2015 to 2020, we worked with local, state, tribal, territorial, and international partners to establish a new antibiotic-resistant laboratory network, launch a strategic initiatives to support antibiotic stewardship in veterinary settings, develop new programs to improve antibiotic use across healthcare settings, support the development of new diagnostic and treatment options, pursue alternatives to antibiotics in agriculture, very critical step, and obtain dozens of multi-sectoral commitments for global action. We are leading the charge for new antimicrobials and protecting the ones we have. You've already mentioned we put our support and financing behind CARB-X, an initiative that has strengthened the research and development pipeline by providing funding and technical and business support for early stage development. Now we have developed an updated National Action Plan for CARB, which incorporates public input provided by the President's Advisory Council on Combating Antimicrobial Resistant Bacteria. That's an advisory committee within my office, and building on evidence-based programs that have already shown impact in human health, animal health, and environmental settings. But it's clear we need to do more, and I think it's not just more, but we need to do different. And I am confident your new partnership will do both. Our U.S. government efforts have also made it abundantly clear, as many of you have already said, that R&D is not enough. We've attained Pyrrhic victories at best. Drug approved, company bankrupt, no products to patients. And that is why I am so pleased that this partnership has not only an R&D focus, but a policy focus. And to be honest, I have complete faith in the science and R&D. We will have solutions. The heavy lift will be the policy. And I am very engaged on this at HHS, as well as the WHO Executive Board. So I do feel privileged to work with you on that in whatever way I can help, in whatever role I can have. And as you've seen, I've had just about every job at HHS, so I have pretty good situational awareness. So in closing, I'm truly enthusiastic about this partnership, and I'm enthusiastic about this day, and I remain cautiously optimistic about the future. There's a long way yet to go, but I think we can get there. So after this justified celebration today, all of us in government and civil society and industry, I think we're all ready to roll up our sleeves and work with you. This is a historic moment, and again, I thank you for the opportunity to share it with you.
Thank you, Admiral Giroir, for your distinguished service, for your leadership during the COVID-19 pandemic, and for taking time to deliver those powerful remarks. Now I'd like to introduce Senator Bob Casey and Senator Bill Cassidy. Senator Casey is a member of both the Senate Finance and Health Committees, and he's been a longtime leader on healthcare issues since first being elected to represent Pennsylvania in 2006. Senator Casey was early to recognize the need for congressional action on antimicrobial resistance and is the lead Democratic sponsor on the DISARM Act, which seeks innovative strategies to fight against AMR. He also recently joined a number of Democratic colleagues in urging the CDC to do more on reporting and surveillance for AMR as a part of the COVID-19 pandemic response, recognizing the importance of this effort in battling future pandemics. Senator Cassidy, a representative from Louisiana, also serves on both the Senate Finance and Health Committees and has a deep understanding of healthcare issues, especially on antibiotic development. He's been at the forefront of almost every healthcare conversation since he was first elected to the Senate 6 years ago. As the Republican co-leader of the DISARM Act, Senator Cassidy brings his deep expertise and interest to the AMR issue. Thanks to both senators for joining us today. And I'd now like to turn it over to Senator Casey.
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity. And as your earlier discussion indicated, antimicrobial resistance is a serious public health threat. We know that. And I'm encouraged to know that so many scientists and policymakers are thinking about what we need to do to address this issue, and especially what Congress must do to be part of that. I want to start by thanking all of you for this opportunity. I want to commend and salute my colleague, Senator Bill Cassidy, for his work. I'll be talking about him a little bit later, but also wanted to say hello to the one Pennsylvanian I know is on your panel, which is Ken Frazier, and I want to say hello to him. But I do want to thank you again for this opportunity, because today's announcement of the AMR Action Fund is a truly important step forward in continuing to ensure a strong pipeline of new antibiotics. Congress has taken some steps to address antibiotic resistance, but we need to do a lot more. Just to give you one example, in 2012, we passed the Generating Antibiotic Incentives Now Act, which is goes by the acronym GAIN, G-A-I-N, GAIN Act, to provide new incentives through the FDA. The GAIN Act allows novel antibiotics to be designated as so-called qualified infectious disease products, as you know, QIDPs, which can then, because of that designation, can then receive fast-track approval and priority review by the FDA, and an extra 5 years of market exclusivity when they are approved. So we've done some on the regulatory side, but we've got to do a lot more. What we really need to think about next is how to create a stable marketplace for these antibiotics once they are approved. That's why I've been working on first with Senator Johnny Isakson, state of Georgia, who retired last year, and now with Senator Bill Cassidy of the state of Louisiana. And I know you're going to hear from Bill shortly. The two of us have developed a proposal, that we call the Disarm Act, as was referred to earlier in your discussion. It stands for the following: developing an innovative strategy for antimicrobial resistance microorganisms, so-called Disarm. As many of you know, the new antibiotics that we need aren't ones that should be used all the time. They are specialized antibiotics that should be used when they have been matched to the infection a patient has. That means, unlike most drugs, the goal of these new antibiotics is not to use them until absolutely necessary. But if an antibiotic isn't used, no one is buying it, and that makes it hard for the developer to recoup their investment. So here's what Disarm does. It creates an add-on payment that the hospital receives, when that hospital submits a reimbursement claim to Medicare. This is similar to what has already been used for reimbursement under Medicare Part D for drugs when administering an antibiotic that has received a QIDP designation. In recognition of how important stewardship is in preserving the clinical value of new antibiotics, the Disarm Act also requires hospital participation in the CDC's antibiotic stewardship program. We do that in order to make sure that the hospital can get the payment. That's something the hospital must do to participate. There are plenty of challenges ahead that we know. We've already tried several times, Bill has and I have, to get the Disarm Act included in other or attached to other pieces of legislation without success so far, but we're going to keep trying. But we're, I think in the Senate at least, changing the conversation, continuing to beat the drum so that the public health threat posed by antimicrobial resistance can be more pronounced in terms of what people understand the threat to be. In closing, I do want to thank Senator Cassidy for his working relationship and joining with me and joining with our office in this effort. We know that because Bill is a doctor, which is a rare commodity in the United States Senate, Bill has a deep understanding of the challenges we face with antimicrobial resistance, and I look forward to working with Bill in a continuing fashion, as well as working with all of you to get this done. Thanks very much.
Hey, thank you all very much for having me, and thank you very much for what you're doing. You know, I'm a physician, and I recall when cefotaxime came out, shows you how old I am, and the drug rep would come around and really promote cefotaxime and get people to use it. Fantastic drug, changed a lot of things. It was the way that the company recouped its investment for having spent so much money to develop the drug. Really a wonderful thing. Now, this is different. Now we've like totally turned the field upside down. We're asking folks to develop drugs, and we're asking doctors not to prescribe them. That is a business model, which is, shall we say, a new paradigm, but a necessary paradigm, and everybody on this call understands why. Now, others have already spoken, but let's just say that we know that, let me just have an article right here. AMR has both intermediate and long-term concerns. A Lancet study recently found a 50% rate of secondary infections in patients who died from COVID. So we see that COVID has not just the relevance that we know it always has, it has particular relevance here as we begin to address death from COVID. Another study, 99 COVID coronavirus patients, bacterial cultures revealed 5 different superbugs present in the population. Now, all that sets the stage that not only do we have the chronic, if you will, ongoing issue of what do we do about superdrugs, we have this even more so now that we have COVID, in which people get super infected with bacterial infections, and the super infection is the cause of death. Now, and that, you know, obviously begs the issue that the next pandemic may be a superbug, which is difficult to eradicate. So you're investing in a public-private partnership that will attempt to head this off. Just look around and wait to happen. And here we're being proactive. You could say, though, this emergency has been rolling out for some time, COVID making it another level of concern. But nonetheless, this is something that is being done that is proactive. I thank you for that. When my staff and I began to look at why were these antibiotics that were being developed, Admiral Giroir spoke about how they're developed and the company goes bankrupt. It's kind of a gallows humor, but that is what has happened. And it's clear that there are not properly functioning market incentives. I thank Bob Casey. I return the hats off to him for including me in his bill after Johnny Ives is retired. But what we do in our bill is attempt to address the market incentives. What we know is that if you have a medication which is more expensive and a hospital is getting a DRG, well, it may be that given the more expensive medicine will get the patient out of the ICU sooner. But I think the way the accountants have looked at it is, wait a second, our DRG does not cover the more expensive drug. And so therefore they is, if you will, discouraged its use. Let's just see if what we already have works, even though knowing that oftentimes it does not. So what we're trying to do with Disarm is unbundle, to allow the payment under Medicare Part A to be, for the antibiotic, to be separate from that for the rest of the DRG. We think that actually doesn't incentivize overuse, but it certainly doesn't disincentivize its use, and that is what is occurring now. It may not be the only answer as to how we develop and pay for these drugs, keeping companies from going bankrupt along the way, but we think if you add it to that which is already being done, it is a significant step forward. By the way, $1 billion is a lot of money, so thank you very much. And most importantly, this suggests that your scientists, some of whom are the best in the world, will be focused on this issue. Folks don't put up $1 billion without making a commitment, not just of money, but of human capital. And we thank you for this. And I'll just close by emphasizing that. The next pandemic may be a super bug. We are preparing now for that next pandemic. And there will be people alive because of this development that otherwise would not be alive. So hats off to everybody involved. I'm privileged to be a part of it, and I look forward to continuing the partnership.
I think we're turning to the panel, so I just want to take a few minutes just to introduce the group and share a few thoughts, and then I'll turn to them for some discussion and questions that I'll pose to each of them, and I'll introduce them in turn. You know, as we grapple right now with once-in-a-generation pathogen and historic pandemic, with all the death and disease that it has already caused and will continue to cause as it courses its way through the population around the world the rest of this year. And we seem burdened here in the US with continued spread that's frankly likely to persist through the fall and the winter as COVID starts to collide with flu season. The circumstance we find ourselves in almost guarantees that we're going to think much differently about infectious disease and the capacities to develop therapeutics against dangerous pathogens, I think, going forward. And while we're talking about antibiotics today, not antivirals, there's a continuum across the two areas where there are, you know, shared capacities and similar imperatives as you look across the two spaces. And going forward, the capacity to develop antibiotics to infectious agents, I think, is going to be seen as a matter of national security. We're going to look at these capacities much differently across the entire infectious disease space. We're going to invest in these capacities very differently. And, you know, we shouldn't underestimate the possibility that one day a very dangerous multi-drug resistant bacteria could become more endemic and not be the rare thing that occurs in the hospital in very vulnerable patients, but be something that achieves the ability to spread much more readily and be much harder to target with our existing drugs. So we don't normally think of anti-infectives the way we think of viruses spreading, but there is the potential that the unforeseen can happen. And so creating more investment opportunities for therapeutic advances in this space, I think is going to require us, as the senators talked about, to rethink the R&D model in this space And today's announcement, in my view, is a big step forward. Ultimately, we need to change the reimbursement model. One idea that we tried to advance at FDA when I was there with the professional staff was a licensing model that we felt would better align the incentives for seldom used drugs that we all want to have access to, but don't want to have to use. If you think about the hospital setting, there's a lot of products in the hospital that are paid for through licensing models where there's sort of a base rate paid for access to a technology or capital investment to support the capital investment, and then perhaps some per use fee layered on top of that. A lot of the capital equipment in hospitals is paid for through these kinds of licensing arrangements or amortization models, and software is paid for that way. And we can consider extending these kinds of models, and many people have. Mark McClellan's worked on this out of Duke. Many people on Capitol Hill have tried to fashion this into legislation, thinking about these models being applied to anti-infectives to create a natural market for these kinds of opportunities. To discuss all of these issues and many more, we have an excellent panel. I want to introduce them in turn as I pose a question to them, and I want to start with Helen and then turn to Kathy. And Helen, I want to just start with you. You've worked on this issue for many years from IDSA. I just want to get your sense of the landscape. How have you seen this challenge from a clinical standpoint evolve, and how do you feel today about the kinds of tools you have and the kinds of opportunities we have to create new tools relative to where we were, when you and I first started talking about this, probably almost 15 years ago?
Yeah, well, Scott, it's nice to be with you, and I'm really honored to be included in this panel today. And in my role as Chief of Infectious Diseases at Tufts and a clinician, first and foremost, as well as in my work at IDSA, it's all about the patients. And I think there's no better way to make the point of where we are and the tools that we need than to tell you just about a couple of quick patients. So the first one is a lady I took care of a couple of months ago who had undergone chemotherapy for leukemia, and she was in complete remission, so no cancer. And we were called when she developed pneumonia and a bloodstream infection due to a gram-negative bacteria that was resistant to every drug the lab tested. And I actually sat with her to give her this news. She was sitting up in a chair at that time. And she said, how can this possibly be true? Of course, you're going to get something to treat this. And, we did a lot of work. We did fancy testing. We consulted a world expert. The FDA granted us emergency use of an investigational drug that is now approved called Cefiderocol. We got it within 4 days. Unfortunately, she still succumbed to that infection in 10 days. And so this lady in the prime of her life who had beaten cancer ended up dying from the drug-resistant infection. So this harkens back to what several of the earlier speakers mentioned. And I want to point out that this was almost a perfect scenario with our best efforts, with friends at the FDA who got us the drug in 4 days. That's better than most. And it highlights the need to not only have the drugs developed, but to have them in the pharmacy when the patients need them. Infectious diseases are very time sensitive. The other patient I want to mention is a young guy I treated who is a transplant recipient, who I treated very recently in our ICU. And he presented with COVID-19 and unfortunately developed pneumonia and respiratory failure, and then developed a drug-resistant infection due to vancomycin-resistant enterococcus. Unfortunately, he responded to antibiotics that we had, but he still has a very long way to go. And this harkens back to what several have mentioned earlier, that the pandemic of antibiotic resistance has been here and is here with COVID. We don't yet know the scope and specter that it will bring us and keep with us as the epidemic of COVID is taking off. We're really just beginning to learn about it, but I think both of these patients and many more highlight the fact that we need antibiotics, not just for our sick patients in the hospital who need IV antibiotics, like the cases I told you about. We need oral antibiotics. We haven't seen new oral antibiotics in years. So the needs are huge. And the other thing I'd like to highlight is that it's not just one antibiotic or even the 2 to 4 that are coming with this really great new public-private partnership, but it's a robust and renewable pipeline that goes on to combat the resistant problems we know about and those that we might not know about that are coming. So thanks very much.
Thanks for that, Helen. Kathy, I want to turn to you. In your role at Pew, you've done work on this for years. You've been tracking this space for years. Can you give us a sense of how you see the pipeline right now and how it's evolved, and where you see things heading? And do we have do we have some reason for optimism in this space based on what you're seeing in the pipeline?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. Happy to talk about that. Yeah, Pew has been tracking the antibiotic pipeline for about 6 years. Unfortunately, year after year, the outlook is grim. We have too few products that are in development to meet both current needs and the future needs that we know are on the horizon. We don't have the number of products that we want. We don't have the novelty of the products that we need to defeat the increasingly resistant bacteria that we hear about only too often. And I think it's important to underline that antibiotic resistance poses unique challenges for drug development. The constantly evolving nature of resistance demands constantly evolving arsenal of antibiotics to defeat them. So there will be no one antibiotic is going to solve this problem, hence the need for a robust pipeline to address this unique issue. So here's the breakdown of the pipeline that Pew just released earlier this year. Currently, there are 41 antibiotics in development. And some people say, oh, that seems like a reasonable number. But when you realize the majority of those antibiotics won't make it all the way through the development process for reasons of toxicity, or maybe they're not as effective as they had hoped. So only a handful of that 41 make it ultimately. And then you start breaking that down even further. There are only 13 of these antibiotics that have the potential to treat the WHO's critical threat pathogens. Those are the ones we really need antibiotics for. And of those 13, again, only some of them, are, if any, are going to make it through the pipeline. And one more statistic here is only 25% of the drugs in development are considered novel. Those are the ones that we really need new mechanisms of action, new approaches to beating the bacteria. So only 25% in the current pipeline, and none of those have the potential to target the gram-negative bacteria, which cause many of the hardest to treat infections. So the summary there is no, the antibiotic pipeline is not adequate. It continues to hobble along. We do not have the therapies that we need to address this. And I think everyone has mentioned COVID. I think it's worth mentioning many times, because when you think about this as a global pandemic, imagine the amount of antibiotics that are being used around the world, and the fact that that is leading to, contributing to a likely resistance. So all the more need for new therapies sooner than later. And while we didn't know COVID was coming, we know antibiotic resistance is not only coming, it's here. And so we have no excuse not to be prepared. We must take urgent action to increase the pipeline. So I'm thankful to the groups of pharmacy companies today that are announcing the AMR Action Fund. It's an important step. As many have mentioned, it's a step. We need a lot more to really get this pipeline into a position that is going to help us stay ahead of the problem.
I'll ask you one quick question, Kathy. I know you know the data really well, so it's a little bit nitpicky, but I think it's an interesting observation, if we can call it. You talked about the 25% that are novel mechanisms. Are more of the highly novel approaches, the new mechanisms, being targeted to the special pathogens, the 13 you talked about, or is it more evenly distributed across different kinds of areas?
Yeah, no, you're actually asking me a question I am not on top of at the moment, so I don't want to misrepresent, but we can follow up on that.
It's it would be an interesting observation. I'm sure you have it somewhere, whether more of the novelty is being targeted towards the areas of significant unmet need or not. And that's basically where I was getting. I want to thanks, Kat. That's great, Kathy, and I appreciate your command of the data, and you've always been a great resource to FDA as well. Kevin, I want to turn to you in your role in Carbex. You're working with a lot of companies with products in the early pipeline. You've obviously seen the announcement today. What are the challenges that you're seeing in your work with these companies that you see the companies having, and how do you think the AMR Action Fund could help address some of those challenges?
Thank you, Scott. As you know, I lead Carbex at Boston University, and we're the world's largest accelerator for antibacterial R&D. We were originally founded by BARDA, by NIAID, and Wellcome Trust. We've now been joined by Germany, the United Kingdom, and the Gates Foundation. We're a nonprofit. We're less than 4 years old. But so far, we have committed $240 million supporting 66 projects in 9 countries after sifting through, amazingly, more than 1,000 applications. We're very focused on innovation, following up on your question there to Kathy. We only target things on the WHO and CDC lists. Many of those 66 projects are new classes, entirely new classes, new targets, or non-traditional alternatives. We lean into innovation at CARB-X. For antibacterial therapeutics, there's about 200 very small companies worldwide that are responsible for the vast majority of all scientific work that's happening today. And when I say very small, I mean really small. Mostly these are companies with 25 or less employees, and a fair number of them with 10 or less. These companies need 2 things. First of all, they need technical assistance in drug development, including clinical trials and pre-commercialization activities. They have smart people doing the work, but they don't have the heft of a large company behind them. And secondly, most urgently, they really need money. CARB-X, we provide both of those things, but one thing we cannot give them is an economically viable future once they graduate from CARB-X at the end of their phase 1 human clinical trials. And at that point, they typically would be looking for a larger company as a partner for both expertise as well as access to capital. Wow, the AMR Action Fund is designed to do exactly that. Most of these companies operate on a shoestring budget. The timing of this AMR Action Fund is life-saving to these research companies, and actually it's life-saving to the world to keep this research going forward. And so we should really take a moment to recognize and thank the leadership exhibited today by these CEOs, these companies. No one forced them to come here today with $1 billion for this important mission, and so I'm grateful that they have. But let me be very blunt. Unless the US government changes antibiotic reimbursement, today's excitement will end in bankruptcy. Big companies exited antibiotics for a very good reason. Bad economics. Several people have talked about it. The economic core problems have not been fixed yet. 1/3 of the antibiotics approved by the FDA in the past decade have gone through bankruptcy or its financial near equivalent in the past 2 years. We're on the cusp of a disaster. So the AMR Action Fund is a $1 billion down payment. I'm grateful. They have bought us valuable time, a little bit of breathing room to get reimbursement fixed. But unless the US government takes the next steps with the antibiotic pull incentive legislation, patients won't get the cures they need. COVID-19 has taught us some really hard lessons about the value of preparedness. Bacterial pandemics move more slowly. The genetics are different from viruses, but bacteria are relentless. We know what is coming. We have the tools clearly at hand. So it's time for us to get to work, and I'm really grateful for the great step forward today.
Kevin, thanks for that. Thanks for your thoughts, and appreciate all the work that you've done on this over the years. Ramani, I want to turn to you, and I'll turn to Mike. You're in a somewhat of similar circumstances with a biotech focused on antibiotic development. Can you share your perspective on what you see the challenges are in the market that you're facing as you try to develop novel agents?
Absolutely, Scott. Thank you, first of all, to the organizers for inviting Xbiotics and myself to the panel. I'm very pleased to be joining this esteemed group here. So I don't know what more to say. I mean, everyone has said it all, but I'll add to what Kevin said, or I'll build on, if I may, what Kevin said, which is unless the macro environment changes, the players such as Xbiotics, of which there are about 200, as Kevin correctly stated, will not be able to thrive and survive. We were founded, I'm a co-founder of the company along with my Harvard colleagues, about 4 years ago at a time when many companies either had exited or were in the process of exiting. And I have to honestly say, most people I spoke with, even investors at the time, were saying, why are you getting into this space? You could do gene therapy, cell therapy, you could do all these really wonderful science, take these wonderful science avenues. Why antibiotics? Well, I'm a microbiologist by training, and so in some ways it's brought me full circle. And there are days when we ask ourselves as a company, I'm not going to kid you, why are we in this space? But the team is passionate. There are companies like us who understand the challenge, who understand the clinical unmet need. The biggest challenge, though, in the marketplace is, so for many small companies, we worry about these valleys of death. So the preclinical valley of death is something most companies, regardless of what indication or what therapeutic area you're in, are aware of. But here we also have a clinical valley of death, and more importantly, a commercial valley of death. So imagine this is a 1, 2, 3 punch for companies that are in this space. In spite of that, we were able to raise a Series A money from investors who frankly are double bottom line. They're really focused on driving unmet change in unmet areas, driving global benefits. And we really need contrarian investors to think that way. And I've spoken with more than 200 smart investors in the past 4 or 5 months alone. And the crux of the issue when we talk about broken marketplace really ends up being, where is reimbursement and where is the commercial infrastructure to support successful product launches and product maintenance? And when we try to incorporate those concepts in our story, we actually fall short. We're not able to appropriately answer that question. We can hand wave a little, although because we know lots of folks in the industry, including ourselves, are fighting the fight to try to effectuate change for reimbursement and other commercial incentives, as were addressed earlier. But at the end of the day, from an investor perspective, and that's what I think about mostly, because a large part of my day is spent talking to investors and pitching the story and telling the story, I have to justify or rationalize the lack currently of an appropriate commercial infrastructure, but rather, and at the same time, I should say in parallel, really pitch to them the value of our science. And we are first in class, novel class antibiotics. As we all know, there's been a discovery void over the past 40 years for novel classes. And we formed the company knowing that we weren't just going to do a me too or a me three, but rather focus on something that was truly value added, both to target pathogen specific approaches as well as targeted gram negative, so slightly broader spectrum. And we've made good progress, but in the absence of initiatives such as CARB-X and this newly launched initiative today, the AMR Impact Fund, which I'm so pleased to hear about, but in the absence of those two, or I should say, in addition to those, we need to have the commercial arguments appropriately addressed. In the absence of that, we're not really checking all the boxes, and I really worry that companies that are similarly situated to us are not going to survive. We're going to have to pivot out of the space, and I think someone alluded to that earlier, or just dissolve overall. And I know from speaking to many colleagues, many companies in this space are hanging on with less than 12 and even less than 6 months of cash. And so from a capital markets perspective, that seems just crazy to think about. And you need to have, therefore, some very dedicated employees and a dedicated team to be doing what we're doing. And we're thankful we have that. But we will continue to fight the fight. Absolutely, we will. But time may run out. And that's not being dramatic. It's just a reality for us. And we have to be mindful as we talk to investors that they need to hear the full story. And the full story doesn't really come to play unless we can almost guarantee to them that reimbursement is going to be addressed in a time frame that matters to everyone.
Thanks for that, Ramani, and your commitment, your continued commitment to a challenging space. Mike, I want to close with you. You represent patients who are badly in need of new innovation, and you've been very innovative in trying to get it to them. Can you give us your perspective on the importance of that continued innovation? Because you're looking into the future and recognizing the challenges that are going to arise for a patient population that's badly in need of continued therapeutic advances.
Scott, thank you. You're right. I am going to speak today from the perspective of the cystic fibrosis community. But as you said, I think the key thing to recognize is that the dire need for novel antibiotics that's seen in CF really sort of compellingly highlights the need for novel antibiotics across all of our society. And as you know, CF is a genetic illness that primarily affects the lungs. It's associated with thick, tenacious mucus and susceptibility to infection that results in people with CF suffering from chronic, difficult to treat lung infections. As a matter of fact, over 60% of people with CF live with chronic, unclearing Pseudomonas infection in their lungs. Nearly 20% of those have multi-drug resistant Pseudomonas infection. And as people with CF live longer lives, we're running out of treatment options for these infections. So what does this look like in real life? I still see patients, and recently I heartbreakingly lost one of my favorite patients, a brave 28-year-old woman who had completed nursing school despite her lung disease, had helped me teach several classes of first-year medical students at Johns Hopkins about CF, someone who inspired everyone she met, especially me. She experienced an exacerbation of her multi-drug resistant Pseudomonas lung infection, and despite weeks of the best available IV antibiotics, her infection continued to progress, and ultimately she died from her infection while awaiting lung transplantation. So as a physician, it is heartbreaking to know exactly what the infection is that's causing a problem, and yet have to tell a patient and their family that we really don't have an effective treatment for it. So, at the CF Foundation, addressing this need is one of our highest priorities, and we are aggressively working to help. 2 years ago, we made a $100 million commitment to the development of new therapies for difficult to treat infections. As you mentioned, we have a track record of accelerating development of transformative therapies by providing funding to help de-risk the earliest stages of drug development, and by providing financial incentives for companies and researchers to focus on medical challenges that might not appear to be as financially rewarding. This includes millions of dollars of co-funding with Carbex earlier this year to accelerate development of a novel mechanism broad-spectrum antibiotic. Obviously, we're particularly excited about today's announcement because of the desperate need of our patients, as I described. But I want to echo what people have been saying and to say very clearly, this must be just an important first step. We need models to assure the economic viability of drugs once they are approved, as we've been talking about. In particular, models that de-link reimbursement from volume of use, right? So we can simultaneously be good stewards of antibiotic use and also assure the availability of effective drugs. So Scott, wonderfully exciting announcement today, one that the CF community is ecstatic about, but also hopefully just one initial key step in a series of steps that will help us as a medical community to overcome the AMR challenge.
Thanks for that, Mike. I just want to thank the panel. We're running short on time, unfortunately, or else I would have posed some additional questions. I want to turn it back to Priscilla and just thank everyone for joining us today.
Thank you so much to our panel. Really meaningful stories shared so much about this issue that is really critical to understand, and that human side of it that makes it so real to everyone. Unfortunately, we don't have time to do further Q&A, but we have captured all of your questions and we are going to follow up individually with you. We have your email addresses and we'll be in touch to answer your questions. And again, feel free to reach out to myself or others with questions following the panel. With that, I would like to turn it back over to Ken Frazier to give us a few closing remarks and end out the event. Thank you all so much for joining.
Thank you, Priscilla. Today's event, I hope has made it clear that AMR is an urgent global threat that could have public health as well as economic consequences over time, even greater than COVID-19, unless we take action right now. The pharmaceutical industry has moved quickly to develop innovative tools for COVID-19, and that the good news is that there are some very promising candidates on the horizon. I am cautiously optimistic that we will have the tools we need as soon as scientifically possible. But while coronavirus was not known before January 2020, AMR is a threat today, and we know exactly what has to be done. AMR is a predictable and preventable crisis, and it's a problem that we can no longer afford to ignore. With the AMR Action Fund, industry is taking action now to sustain the fragile antibiotic pipeline, which we heard from the last panel is close to collapse. But the fund is just a temporary and time-limited bridge that will only work if key governments, including the US, make the necessary reforms to create a sustainable market. I'm very encouraged by the commitments described by Senator Casey and Senator Cassidy to make sure hospital reimbursement systems support appropriate access to novel antibiotics, as well as the strong support for AMR innovation from Admiral Giroir. Working together, government, industry, clinicians, and NGOs, We can solve the antibiotic innovation crisis and ensure that patients like Brandon and those that Helen treats every day have the life-saving treatments they need against resistant bacteria. I thank you all very much for your participation in today's launch event, and I encourage you to learn more about the AMR Action Fund by visiting its website, www.amractionfund.com. We look forward to collaborating with you to drive antimicrobial innovation. Thank you again for joining us, and let's all make sure that we don't have the next pandemic catch us unprepared.